From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. The United Nations Security Council is holding right now a debate on the situation in Venezuela. One of the first to speak was the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, who demanded that the UN recognize the self-proclaimed opposition figure Juan Guaidó as interim president. That is something the UN has repeatedly refused to do so and was roundly criticized by Russia and China. We are now looking at images of the South African delegation speaking at the UN.
Unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance takes place in
That is the South African ambassador speaking at the UN Security Council, where they'll discuss the situation in Venezuela.
The fundamental principles of state sovereignty as reflected in the UN Charter. It is therefore necessary to acknowledge and work with established structures in Venezuela so as not to create parallel structures that may also cause increased tension in that country. Third and finally, Mr. President, the provision of humanitarian assistance should be based on an adequate and accurate needs, as Mr. Lowcock was saying, of the situation in order to match these needs with appropriate support and steer away totally from the possibility of humanitarian intervention being used as a pretext for increased tension, including possibility of military intervention. Mr. President, South Africa therefore urges all parties to respect the need for impartiality, neutrality, and independence in the provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. We also call on the international community to support the channeling of humanitarian assistance through the UN agencies. And we are very grateful, Mr. Lowcock, to say you have increased the capacity of personnel to over 400. We hope we can see more in Venezuela and more such UN presence in the neighboring countries. But also, we should do so through other recognized international organizations such as the ICRC in order to promote the much-needed neutrality and impartiality for provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. I thank you. I know I'm going to speak on time. Thank you very much.
Jerry, no comment. I give the floor to the ambassador of Indonesia. Tani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, permit me to, like others, thank the briefer of today. I will focus my intervention to address 3 points related to the humanitarian situation. I think that is supposed to be our main focus of today. First is the deteriorating humanitarian situations, which we have been following closely. We are deeply concerned of it. We heard the briefings that the people of Venezuela is experiencing.
And we'll go back to that live feed as we have more information. But let's look back. The permanent Russian representative to the UN, Vasily Nebensia, emphatically rejected United States interventionism in Venezuela. He stated that with one hand, the U.S. calls for humanitarian assistance, but with the other, it steals from the Venezuelan people.
Reject the methods of the United States with regard to Venezuela. With the one hand, you're grabbing Venezuela by the throat by introducing still new sanctions and restrictions which prevent the country from developing normally. At the same time, international assistance that is required by states should be aimed at creating a situation where a state can take care of its own citizens. However, with the other hand, you are also picking the pockets of Venezuelans. You're shamelessly expropriating Venezuelan assets in Western banks. Just from the beginning of this year, you have taken some $30 billion from the country, claiming that only the self-proclaimed President Guaidó can use those funds. The overall damage from the actions of the United States to the Venezuelan economy since 2013 can be calculated in hundreds of billions of dollars.
We now go to Cuba. The country has proclaimed its new constitution during a ceremony at the National Assembly in Havana. The new text will substitute the previous constitution of 1976. The revised articles of the constitution were presented and discussed by Cubans and ratified on February 24th on a referendum. Almost 7 million voters, about 86%, ratified it, and later it was approved by the National Assembly. The electoral body reiterated the transparency and efficiency during the election. This constitution reinforces the socialist system of the island.
This constitution is relevant to these times, and it reflects the historical circumstances of our society and guides the changes made with a vision of the future, with the supreme objective of reaching a socialism which is every day more prosperous, sustainable, inclusive, and with the participation of all. With it, the revolutionary state is stronger, from which we demand transparency and respect for the law. It respects the right of women and men, and equality of all Cubans, without discrimination, and those are the pillars of our society. And just as Fidel Castro said on that first Congress of the party, and I quote, "Today we need a socialist constitution that goes along the characteristic of our society, with a social conscience, the ideological conviction, and the desires of our people, a constitution to have the general laws for the society we have built, with the profound economic, social, and political transformation made by the revolution and the historic achievement by our people. A constitution that consolidates what we are now and helps us achieve what we want to be tomorrow."
And during that ceremony, Raúl Castro said he had warned about the attempts of the United States to destroy the example of the Cuban Revolution and attack Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia.
The historic enemies of the revolution tried to question this, but it all falls after the massive support of our people. We have alerted about the aggressive action of the U.S. government against Latin America and the Caribbean. In name of the Monroe Doctrine, with an arrogant distance towards socialism, the freedom of its people, and the sovereign rights of the region.
On this day, Cuba also remembers 150 years of the first constitution of Guaymaro. Government and National Assembly authorities were part of this commemoration to underline the importance of the historic fact, which was led by the father of the homeland, Manuel de Céspedes, leader of the independence. And on Tuesday, the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States approved a resolution on Venezuela amidst scenes of confusion and strong objections from several member states. The session, presided over by the United States, voted 18-9 in favor of recognizing the representative of the opposition figure Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's permanent envoy to the OAS. Mexico called it a Pyrrhic victory and challenged the right of the Permanent Council to take such a decision.
The adoption of this resolution is a Pyrrhic victory for a certain group of countries, which will have no impact on the real situation, but could cause serious consequences for the OAS itself and its institutions. Among these is the following. This resolution adopted is contrary to this organization rules and to normal multilateral practice. Is the Permanent Council the appropriate body? Are 18 votes a sufficient threshold? There is a real risk of paralysis in the organization, with a real risk of a permanent questioning of this or that representative.
Uruguay, Bolivia, Antigua and Barbuda, and Nicaragua also said the vote violated the OAS rules and that they put the future of the organization in danger.
The Republic of Uruguay believes that the procedures used to adopt this resolution are not in line with the norms of this Organization of American States. It considers that this Permanent Council does not have the power to make this sort of decision, and therefore it does not recognize its legal validity and will not be bound by its content.
We would like to say that the present disastrous course of a simple majority prevailing over all other matters of major significance in this organization should end in the interests of the organization and in the interests of our hemisphere. We, for our part, will continue to keep the door open for reasoned and reasonable dialogue with all member states on all issues that beset our hemisphere in the hope that we can very quickly return this organization to consensus in decision-making.
The decision taken by the OAS also generated a reaction in Cuba. On his Twitter account, the Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, rejected it. He said that there was an irrational violation of procedures at the discredited OAS after accepting, through a decision imposed by the United States, an alleged representative of a member state that didn't ask for it and had requested to leave the organization. He added that it is unacceptable interference in internal affairs of Venezuela. And Venezuela's Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza, expressed his disapproval of this resolution by taking to social media. On Twitter, he said that it is not surprising to see Washington break international law and destroy institutions like the OAS. The Foreign Minister said it highlights the slave-like submission to the U.S. of several governments in the region. Arreaza, he says that it is obvious that some fall to extortion and that others because they like to be subordinated. We'll take a short break now. Don't go away.
Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your Earth. Green Zone. Wednesdays, only on Telesur. Welcome back. Dutch and French-speaking Caribbean countries may impose immigration restrictions on British citizens if the UK pulls out of the European Union without a deal. The islands include Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin and Saint Barthélemy. The UK Foreign Office issued a travel update warning that the situation was uncertain in those states. Other countries that may impose limits on British immigration are Reunion and Mayotte on the Indian Ocean, New Caledonia and French Polynesia in the Pacific, and French Guinea off the coast of South America. A Trinidadian broadcaster based in Barbados passed away on Wednesday. Vioma Ali died from a heart attack. She was a marketing specialist in Barbados and was a well-known voice on Capital Media HD 99.3. Ali was formerly employed at Starcom Network Inc. and was a columnist for Barbados Today. Dominica's Douglas Charles Airport reopened on Tuesday evening. The airport was closed after a twin-engine aircraft crashed on Monday. All 32 people on board the plane escaped major injuries. Normal operations are expected to resume following the removal of the damaged plane. The controversial Unexplained Wealth Bill has been passed in the lower house of Trinidad and Tobago's parliament. After several hours of deliberations, all 34 members voted in favor of the amended bill that seeks to probe people's unexplained wealth for the recovery of criminal property. The proposed law has no exception for sitting members of government.
Why should corrupt politicians, why should people in public life who are guilty of misbehavior in public office be afraid to explain themselves in a court of law? People in this country, in talking about Mr. Big over and over again, make an allegation of politicians that they're either crooks or mooks. And they believe that all politicians are crooked. And here we have a government saying, come and inspect everybody in the government side. Come and inspect everybody in the government side. And the only people in this parliament who are saying, don't do that, don't inspect me, is the opposition.
A group of 25 Sahrawi journalists persecuted by the Moroccan occupation forces are now being recognized for their efforts to block the media blockade on the last African colony.
Cameras, cell phones and the internet are the main tools for Keep Media, a group of Sahrawi journalists that are trying to break the media blockade imposed on Western Sahara since 1975.
Keep Media was founded in 2009, aimed at breaking the media blockade. Doing so despite all the obstacles we have suffered to do our job, all the risks we have taken, like being in prison and even the death of our colleagues.
From the roofs of Western Sahara, they tried to record the constant aggressions and arbitrary detentions perpetrated by the Moroccan occupation forces against the Sahrawi people.
Equip Media tries to show the actions perpetrated by the Moroccan occupation forces in the Western Sahara. There has been no self-determination yet, and for that reason we try to report, in order to achieve self-determination for our people.
Since 1975, Spain has been considered the administrative power of Western Sahara, as it has not carried out the decolonization process properly, something that is hidden by Spanish media outlets.
In the last 5 to 7 years, due to the economic crisis, Spanish media outlets have taken a step towards the mercantilization of content. They only promote commercial content, and the Western Sahara does not fit with that. It also aligns with the Spanish state, which is not interested in solving the Western Sahara situation.
5 members of Equip Media are currently in prison, among them Mohamed Bambari, sentenced to 12 years for recording the demonstrations and the detentions prompted by the occupation forces.
Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi continue to deal with the after effects of the devastating cyclone Idai. Hundreds of people are still missing and thousands are in need of food, water and shelter. As of Monday, almost 1,000 people had been reported dead in the 3 countries. Mozambique was the worst affected, with 600 people killed and almost 2 million affected by a cholera outbreak. Search efforts are still ongoing in neighboring Zimbabwe, with many missing bodies believed to have been washed away or buried underground. Zambian villagers have won a landmark victory in a British court against mining giant Vedanta over alleged pollution. In 2015, the villagers accused the company of poisoning their water and destroying their farmlands. They have been fighting for the right to seek compensation in British courts for several years. Vedanta had argued that the case should be heard in Zambia. However, the UK Supreme Court disagreed and allowed the case to proceed in the UK. In India, a Vedanta-owned copper smelting plant was closed by authorities in May 2018 on similar allegations. Protests continue in Algeria despite interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah announcing that elections will be held in 90 days. Demonstrators are calling for immediate elections and an entire change of government. They have vowed to continue protests until their demands are met. Algeria has had a series of strikes since February 22nd, which forced Abdelaziz Bouteflika to resign after 20 years in office.
They have to go. They all have to go. They are undeserving. Not Ben Salah, Bedavu or Benes. Not a single one. We need a new country, a new country. Let us live. Leave.
And the head of the Algerian army has urged the judiciary to start prosecuting what he describes as the country's ruling elite. Lieutenant Ahmed Gaid Salah said the judiciary should launch proceedings into corruption, abuse of power, and plundering of the resources by the political elite. Salah described the men around the former president as the gang. On Wednesday, the Algerian Interior Ministry issued licenses to 10 new political parties. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Martin Fayulu's Lamuka coalition has won the delayed legislative polls in the eastern region. The polls were originally scheduled for December 30th, but were postponed due to an Ebola epidemic and violence in the region. Results released by the Electoral Commission show that Fayulu's party won 10 seats, while the President Felix Tshisekedi and his party won just 1. We have more stories coming up. We'll be back.
The Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali examines the mass media influence promoted by imperialism. Get access to the analysis of the socio-economic and political life of the whole South America on our screen and platform in English. A critical place committed to the truth to determine the major events that transformed the world today. On Monday, only on Venezuela.
Thank you for joining us again. In Sudan, thousands of protesters have pressed on demanding the resignation of President Omar al-Bashir. For 5 days, demonstrators have continued to throng the army complex throughout the night. Protests were originally sparked by the rise in the cost of living in December, but demonstrators now want the entire government to leave. The UN Refugee Agency moved more than 100 refugees from the Ain Sara detention center in South Tripoli on Tuesday to a safe zone as fighting for Libya's capital intensifies. There have been heavy clashes near the Ain Sara center in recent days. Libya has become the main conduit for African migrants and refugees trying to reach Europe, with many detained in horrendous conditions to prevent them from doing so. According to the UN, thousands of refugees and migrants are trapped in detention centers in conflict areas.
We are in Tripoli today, where we have relocated more than 150 vulnerable refugees from Ain Sara detention center, where the clashes were happening, to UNHCR's gathering and departure facility in Tripoli. We continue to call for the safety and protection of all refugees who are in detention centers, and today it's a sign that when everyone works together, we can make it happen and have these refugees who are finally safe here at the gathering and departure facility.
Meanwhile, thousands of residents have been forced to flee their homes as Commander Khalifa Haftar's forces and troops loyal to the government in Tripoli fought on the outskirts of Libya's capital on Wednesday. The Libyan National Army, forces of the Commander Haftar, had taken up positions in the suburbs, about 11 kilometers south of the center, and Haftar's forces briefly took the city's international airport. In other news, with 97% of votes counted in the Israeli legislative elections, current right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a clear path to form another government. Netanyahu's Likud party is tied with challenger Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, with the 35 seats that each of them have in the Knesset. However, Netanyahu is said to align with a far-right-wing nationalist bloc in the Israeli parliament. Doing so would ensure the current PM a majority, meaning he is set for a record 5th term in office. And this election was seen as a referendum on Netanyahu's leadership, and the results were excellent for the reactionary Israeli PM. Netanyahu is expected to be charged with corruption later this year, but with a favorable parliament, it appears he will serve as prime minister despite being indicted. And the technically enfranchised Arab voters in Israel recorded a historically low voter turnout as they protested against the racist Israeli policies through a boycott. Palestinian voters who did participate in the election were surveilled by Likud party activists.
The general idea is to boycott the institution that actively tries to erase us from the land of Palestine, that tries to make the life of the diaspora harder, tries to make our lives harder wherever the Palestinian people are.
And almost 5 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip are not allowed to vote in the elections. This is the case even though Israeli policy defines the living conditions in Palestine. Palestinians face constant oppression and displacement as increasingly right-wing administrations in Israel deny them their basic rights.
It was obvious from the beginning. Netanyahu's campaign was strong because it was about the Palestinian blood, the settlement expanding, and the sanctions on the Palestinians. It was obvious.
We now go live to the UN Security Council where Samuel Moncada, the representative of Venezuela, is speaking.
Vice President of the United States here. We're supposed to be here discussing the humanitarian situation, but I think we need to respond to what he said so we can clarify things before the international community, before the people of Venezuela, before the media. He lied in saying that yesterday the region as a whole rejected the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in the Organization of American States. That is false. That is a lie. It is misinformation, a problem that perhaps he needs to address with his legal team. Yesterday, what happened in their thirst to promote a coup d'etat in Venezuela and impose a puppet government to uphold their interests, the U.S. interests in Venezuela, which would allow for the pillaging of our resources, then they ran roughshod over the founding charter of the OAS, which is commensurate with the Charter of the United Nations. And they twisted the law to such an extent that what was approved was not the expulsion of the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the OAS. Rather, they approved and adopted the inclusion of a representative of the National Assembly of Venezuela. And this is absurd. It's a legal fiction, what happened yesterday, because the OAS, just like the United Nations, is an organization of states. It is not an organization bringing together national assemblies. And the only state present representing us in this organization is the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Thus, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was not expelled from the OAS. What we have instead in the OAS is a strange individual. Nobody understands what he's doing there, what he will be doing there, because he doesn't represent the state of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He represents the National Assembly. It's important to understand that. So what was said was a lie. Why do I flag this here? Because this is just part of the machinery of lies which is intended to sell the course of action of the United States to the members of the United Nations. What they're seeking to do is impose a puppet government, and they want to convince the United Nations of the rightness of their actions. They want to see the United Nations as the club of friends, the backyard of the United States. They have to subordinate the United Nations to their interests, to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine being a racist policy that was set up 200 years ago by a slaving state, and which runs roughshod over international law. It has no basis in international law. There's no basis in international law for what the United States is doing. We are sure when the United States attempted to pull the wool over the eyes of the attempts here in the United Nations to play the same trick as it played in the Organization of American States, pulling the wool over the eyes of those present, it will fail here. We certainly hope it will fail here. It has threatened with war. It has threatened us with war as well. All options are on the table. On what legal basis are all options on the table? On what legal basis can one country threaten another with war here around this room? This is something else the United Nations should address. Now turning to the topic that brings us together here, President. The humanitarian situation in Venezuela does need to be resolved. But if we err in the diagnosis, then we will also be mistaken in the treatment that we give that's intended to bring succor to Venezuela. The situation, as has been said here, is the fruit of human action. But what everyone has tiptoed around here in the room, including the three briefers who are very smart, intelligent people, they're able to draw together data, analyze that data, including Mr. Stein, who's a very wise man, but they shut their eyes to what the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela wants to share with them. But they will hear, for example, the dictator government in Guatemala. That has been done by Mr. Stein and his team, but yet they refuse to meet with us to hear what we have to say. But as I was saying, none of the three briefers and none of the members of the Security Council acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that the actions that have led to the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing in Venezuela are the direct fruit of a plan of economic destruction put together by the government of the United States and the United Kingdom with the goal of strangling our national economy, thus triggering the maximum degree of social suffering, eroding the capacity of our nation for self-sufficiency and to respond to said suffering. And when all is said and done, the intention here is to provoke a social implosion that they can then use as a pretext for foreign military intervention, hiding behind the perverse notion of the responsibility to protect that has been the pretext wielded for colonial invasions of those countries that have oil reserves. This is a mind-boggling, inhumane experiment in unconventional warfare. It's a policy of calculated cruelty, violating en masse human rights, going so far, I would say, as to being equivalent to committing crimes against humanity. And all of this is done with the goal of justifying the pillaging and looting, to justify the imposing of a subordinate and puppet local government, and in our particular case, hiding behind a racist ideology, the Monroe Doctrine. People might think that we're exaggerating, but you only need to hear the words themselves of these criminals. This is not what I had to say. This is what has been said by these criminals by the United States. On the 9th of January 2018, spokespersons of the Department of State affirmed that the campaign of pressure targeting Venezuela is working. And what we are seeing is a complete economic collapse in Venezuela. In other words, our policy is working, our strategy is working, and we will stay the course with this policy and with this strategy, end of quote. In October of last year, Ambassador William Brownfield of the United States said, and here I quote directly, "We need to treat this as a suffering, tragedy, agony that will continue until it reaches its endpoint. And if we can do anything to speed up this process of tragedy and agony, then we should do it, understanding that this will have an impact on millions of people who are already having difficulties daily in finding food and medicine. We cannot pursue this course of action and pretend that it will have no impact whatsoever. We have to take a hard and harsh decision. The end justifies the means of this severe punishment." These are not diplomatic words. These are not the words of a humanitarian agent. This is inhumane. This is cruel. These are the words justifying an international crime, a determination and a willingness to punish the entire Venezuelan people. Senator Marco Rubio, who supported the coup d'etat in Venezuela, stated that over the next few weeks, Venezuela will go through a period of suffering that no other country in the Western Hemisphere has ever suffered in modern history. And on the 22nd of March 2019, John Bolton, of infamous memory and ignominy in this organization, said that this is like Star Wars. This is similar to when Darth Vader strangled someone, snuffed their life out. This is what we're doing economically to Venezuela. I'm not inventing any of this. You can go back and check. These are their words. This is deliberate economic destruction. It's the systematic application of the policy of aggression with the use of financial instruments wielded against us and undue pressure. They have used their dominant position in the markets to influence the banking sector, private businesses, and wielded by the United States. And all of this is to isolate our country from.
See? Yes.
Affirmed here so many times as part of a litany of lies. If it was true that the Venezuelan government, as has been claimed erroneously, is killing its own people, then why is this group of countries doing all it can on such a mass scale to increase the suffering? Why would there be the need if we're already responsible for the suffering of our people? This gives the truth to the lie. It is them who are responsible for the suffering of our people. It is them who are seeking social breakdown to justify their invasion. It is a plan in which banks, insurance companies, and indeed the tools of trade, such as boats and shipping systems, are used with a destructive capacity comparable to weapons of mass destruction, but without those responsible for this suffering being taken before the courts to suffer the moral sanction that they deserve. John Bolton said in January of this year, "My advice to bankers, businessmen, and other traders is not to trade in gold, oil, or other Venezuelan products." Whilst on the 29th of March 2019, Elliot Abraham said, "We're imposing our sanctions." This is what he said directly. "We, the United States, are imposing our sanctions." And what is the regime doing in response? The regime is trying to find ways to sidestep said sanctions, to seek out new clients, to seek new markets for imports. So what do we do in response? We observe very closely, and we can see boats on the ocean moving, and we can see contracts being signed with new companies. And the minute we detect such action, we speak with the shipping companies, with the transport companies, with the refineries, with the governments, and we tell them you should not be doing this. This is what we are doing. That's what Mr. Abrahams was saying. He who is depicted here as an angel, an agent of humanity and humanitarian action. This reprehensible act is a criminal policy of mass destruction, and it goes hand in hand with the looting and pillaging that has cost our nation so many millions of dollars. At the same time as they're depriving our people of essential goods, leading to huge levels of suffering, they are with the left hand robbing our Venezuelan people of thousands of millions, if not billions of dollars. The profits of our refineries are being used to pay the debts of oil companies that are friendly to the government of Trump. His friends hold Venezuelan debt, and they're receiving special licenses to pursue profits with money stolen from our people. That's what they're lining their pockets with. That's what they're profiteering from. They have announced a plan to lead into debt my country, which has led to a debt of $70 billion. And this money is used to pay uncertified debts that are allegedly the fruit of shadowy financial negotiation, but nobody can prove the amount of these debts which this money is allegedly being used to pay off. We cannot forget the fact that the Bank of England, which robbed our people of $1.2 billion in gold with the excuse that they did not recognize the president of Nicolas Maduro, and they will continue the sanctions of Trump. And then we hear the representative of the United Kingdom talking about the fact that they took this step to avoid money laundering, which is just ridiculous. That gold has been in the Bank of England for 30 years now, with nobody raising concerns about money laundering whatsoever. They are working together with the puppet government and saying that they are complying with the sanctions of the United States and with the order of the British government to recognise the puppet government. The credibility of the Bank of England as a neutral and impartial organisation has been ruined. Their reputation is as naught. All they're doing is supporting the government of Trump. The colonialist policies of Trump are building on their own colonialist history and their own history of piracy, which they pursued for at least the last 200 years. This is the real cause of the plight of Venezuelan people. There is no other reason for it. Our people are suffering, and our government too, as can be testified to by the Secretary General, who is working closely and hard with the United Nations system to boost the number of cooperation projects as well as the volume and capacity of these programs, particularly in the healthcare sector as well as the sectors of food, education, electricity and transport. There can be no doubt, President, if you were better informed in Venezuela, you would know that vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our coverage of vaccinations for malaria and measles, for example, and to be able to stamp out these diseases has improved markedly thanks to our partnership with organizations such as the World Health Organization. People are being deceived. Their vaccines are available in Venezuela, and our healthcare coverage, including the delivery of vaccines, has improved remarkably over the last few years. All of that is measurable. The same is happening with our cooperation with the ICRC, the president of whom met yesterday in Caracas with our head of state, Nicolas Maduro, to make progress in the founding of a direct mechanism that would facilitate genuinely neutral, impartial and independent assistance. And the same can be said of friendly countries who stand ready to provide assistance on a peaceful basis and fully respecting our sovereignty in so doing. One key factor that has been underestimated by those who are waging war against Venezuela is the sheer strength of our national spirit, which only increases when we are faced with difficulties. This macabre experiment in destruction and bringing to its knees nations is seeking to prove that economic crimes do work for these nefarious ends, that people will eventually break and that they will cede to the oppressive foreign power. Nonetheless, in Venezuela, they have miscalculated. The collective suffering caused is resisted by growing levels of organization and determination in our people. Our Bolivarian National Armed Forces have not broken and are more united than ever. Our workers are reacting to the attacks on our infrastructure with a discipline that the aggressors are unfamiliar with and cannot boast of for themselves. There are problems that we have to deal with, but they are not and there are problems, there are some instances of aggression and violence, but they are not aimed at civil war. And this will not be the end game for all that those who are bringing this pressure to bear on us would like it to be the case. Our people is setting an example to the world of how to resist in peace. It might be logical to think that the efforts of our government to overcome the difficulties caused by this aggression would in fact be recognized, applauded and supported by the international community, who claim to be so interested in alleviating suffering. Rather, what we're seeing is a fresh wave of economic extortion, which is cutting off financial flows to our country and from our country to abroad, and is also affecting our cooperation with the very agencies of the United Nations, who, as I speak, are unable to find a way to receive funding and money and to send the necessary goods and supplies to meet the needs of our people. And do you know why that is the case? It is because the government of Trump is engaged in a campaign of terror against commercial and financial agents who have anything to do with Venezuelan money. We are not asking for handouts or for anybody's money. We have our own money, but the government of Trump terrorizes economic actors, traders and international agencies so that they won't actually touch the money that we're willing to offer to pay for the services they can provide. What the United States is interested in, and has been interested in thus far, is not humanitarian aid, but rather a covert operation without the consent of Venezuela, violating our territorial integrity with a constant threat of the use of force, as we heard again today, and openly inciting a military uprising and civil war. That's the speciality of this government of Mr. Abrahams. President, this Security Council bears the responsibility, according to Articles 24, 34 and 39 of the Charter, a responsibility to maintain and uphold international peace and security, and to identify the existence of threats to peace, and also to identify and respond to acts of aggression. And thus we would solicit, we would demand, that we request that you identify and determine the following. Firstly, what is the legal basis allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to apply to Venezuela a program of economic destruction without the express consent of this Security Council? They're enacting measures covered in Article 41 of the Charter, including an economic blockade, without the authorization and consent of the Security Council. When the Security Council reached that finding that these two nations, the United States and the United Kingdom, are acting without the consent of the Security Council and without the covering of the Charter. My second question to you: what legal authority does the United States have to sanction to imply secondary sanctions to countries that trade legally with Venezuela? Thirdly, the Security Council needs to determine what is the legal basis allowing the United States to threaten Venezuela with the use of military force. Where is this legal basis to be found? Why has there been no statement made in response to what is clearly being done by the United States, such clear threats? Fourth, I would ask the Security Council to determine what is the legal authority allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth. We're supposed to thank them for their offer of $9 million to address the humanitarian situation in Venezuela when the Bank of England stole $1.2 billion of our money. The Bank of England is supposed to be an independent organisation. We hear from the Bank of England themselves that we are obeying the government of the United Kingdom, despite their alleged independent status. As I was saying, my fourth question to you, that you as the Security Council need to determine what is the legal authority used by the United States and the United Kingdom to appropriate our wealth, obtaining profit therefrom with a mass violation of the human rights of our people. Fifth, what is the legal basis allowing the United States to intervene in affairs that are strictly the preserve of the internal preserve of the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan government in a flagrant violation of Article 2.7 of the Charter. To conclude, the diagnosis of the current situation, President, is that it is clearly and blatantly the result of a campaign of aggression meted out by the United States and the United Kingdom. The treatment for this suffering cannot be a fresh dose of aggressive intervention hiding behind a humanitarian facade. The solution is not in donations from criminals who want to present themselves or set themselves up as saviors. The treatment for Venezuela is not in humanitarian channels designed to provoke and trigger armed conflict, or in donor conferences that hide what's actually going on, the looting and pillaging of the resources of our nation. The treatment, rather, lies in returning the money which has been stolen to Venezuela, in lifting the commercial and financial blockade on our people, in ceasing the sabotage of our infrastructure in clandestine operations, in ceasing the threats of military intervention, and in ceasing to threaten those Venezuelans who want to engage in dialogue. We must stop this war of Donald Trump, and this Security Council must live up to its responsibility and live up to its mandate, guaranteeing that Venezuela can enjoy its right to peace. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic.
Venezuela's ambassador Samuel Moncada asked the UN Security Council a couple of questions. He said, what is the authority of the US of giving sanctions, of threatening with military options, of appropriating the country's wealth, and for intervening in internal affairs? We'll see the response of the UN Security Council. And with that, we come to the end of this news brief, but you can find more on this on our website, telesurenglish.net. For our viewers in Africa, you can find us on Starsat channel 461 in South Africa and 539 in Nigeria. And you can join us on social media as well. I'm Carla Gonzalez for Telesur English. Thank you for watching.